Anyone familiar with UFO stories will be familiar with the Men in Black. These strangers supposedly come to threaten anyone with too much information or interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials. While many consider them to be an urban myth, some of the claims are hard to ignore. In this Sci-Five, we list off 5 mysterious encounters with the Men in Black. Number 5. Danny Gordon. Danny was a radio journalist from Wythe County, Virginia. In the late 1980s, there were many reports of UFOs all over the county. Danny decided to write a story on the report as a joke piece, but when he was flooded with phone calls from listeners with similar claims, he started an investigation and quickly became obsessed. He collected photos, including an instance where an entire school bus of students witnessed a UFO over a shopping mall. Gordon also began taking his own photos, some even at an extremely close range. As his investigation grew, an unexpected spotlight fell on him. He received a phone call from a mysterious man who presented himself as ex-military. The man warned him he should cease his investigation for his family's sake, and that if he continued, it could cost him everything. He also claimed to have lost a son to leukemia due to UFO research. Danny did continue his research, though it did not go undisturbed. His home was broken into, but the thief left no damage, and only took one single roll of film. Danny started to notice a pop in his phone line whenever the topic of UFOs was brought up, and claimed his daughter began to suffer nosebleeds. He was told both of these could have been a result of microwave surveillance techniques. This was just the beginning of his troubles. Not long after, 2 men who claimed to be reporters from Charlottesville visited him in his home and asked him questions regarding UFOs. One of them supposedly pretended to feel sick in order to enter the house and search his belongings. After they left, Gordon noticed all of his photos were missing. He called the magazine the men claimed to be from to get information. However, they responded by saying that they had never visited, and they never even commissioned an article about him. He would continuously receive phone calls at strange hours of the day, many telling him to back off the case, threatening that the government would eliminate him. Others told him that they had met before on a spaceship. Gordon's wife and daughter left to their mother's house out of fear, and Gordon himself soon suffered a mental breakdown. He was advised by his doctor to discontinue his research as it was jeopardizing his health. He gave up the story and was never bothered again. Now, the government claims the sightings were actually of aircraft refueling operations, though many witnesses claim what they saw was much too low in the sky for this explanation. Also contradictory to this, Danny said he called the Pentagon, who apparently confirmed UFOs exist, but said they were not a threat to Wythe County. What do you make of this explanation? Number 4. Dr. Herbert Hopkins. At the time of his encounter, Dr. Herbert Hopkins was working in Maine as a consultant for a UFO case. As Hopkins was working one night, he received a phone call from a person who claimed to be a UFO activist. They agreed that the unknown person could come to visit Hopkins to discuss the case he was working on. What Hopkins didn't expect was the immediate arrival of the stranger. The moment the man entered his home, his dog began to bark loudly, and Hopkins felt odd, as if acting irrationally. He had not inquired about the man's name and let a stranger into his home with no questions asked, while completely alone. Hopkins described the man to be wearing a black suit and tie. His face was very unusual as it had no eyebrows or hair, and he was extremely pale. The man started to question him about the case he was working on, and then things got weird. The man somehow knew Hopkins had 2 coins in his pocket and told him to take one out. Confused, Hopkins did as he was asked. He held the penny in his hand, and the man told him to keep his eyes on it. The penny slowly turned to a silvery color, began to fade, and then disappeared completely. The man told Hopkins the coin would never be seen on this plane again. Now, this is quite an interesting statement when looking back on the memorandum of importance from my previous video, Government Documented UFO Reports. The information complements the story very well. The man began to ask Hopkins if he had ever heard of UFO abductee Barney Hill. The man then said Barney didn't have a heart, just like you'd no longer have a coin. He then told Hopkins to destroy all material from the UFO case. After that, the stranger's attitude suddenly changed. He seemed fatigued and out of breath, saying, "Have to go now. My energy is running low. Goodbye." He left the house and followed a bright light coming from Hopkins' driveway. Hopkins says he ran to the window to see the light, but by the time he had, it disappeared. Hopkins was terrified from the encounter and did as the man told him and burned all the files he had. He never did see the man again, but supposedly had phone trouble after the incident. Apparently his phone company told him that his line had been tampered with. There is speculation that the story was a hoax, as a supposed relative of Hopkins came out saying he was an alcoholic and often made up stories for attention. However, on the night of the event, his family was also said to have seen the weird streaks in the driveway, and believed the story. Do you? Let me know in the comments. Number 3. Robert Richardson. In July of 1967, Robert Richardson was driving his car at night through Toledo, Ohio, when he suddenly spotted a strange object blocking the road just around the bend. He braked and tried to avoid the object, and although decreasing the severity of the collision, he hit it. On impact, the object completely vanished. He reported the event to the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization and claimed the object was a UFO. On a later visit, police accompanied Robert to the site to investigate. They supposedly found only one set of skid marks, and Robert himself found a piece of metal he believed could have come from the UFO. 3 days after the incident, Robert says he was visited by two men who looked to be in their 20s. Similar to Herbert Hopkins' case, Robert said to his surprise he did not think to ask the men who they were. They questioned him for about 10 minutes in a friendly manner and gave no warnings. When they were finished questioning, they left in a 1953 black Cadillac, a common staple in Men in Black claims. 1 week later, Robert was visited from two different men, this time driving a Dodge. They wore black suits, and contrary to most Men in Black encounters, they had a dark complexion. One of them supposedly had an accent, and Robert felt something odd and foreign about them. They began to try to persuade him he hadn't hit anything, and then moved on to ask for the piece of metal he had collected. He told them it had been sent in for analysis, but this angered them. They apparently threatened him, saying, "If you want your wife to stay as pretty as she is, then you'd better get the metal back." There was no apparent connection between the two pairs of visitors, but they both somehow had information that seemed impossible for them to have acquired. Sometimes with these stories, it's hard to find convincing evidence that the claim ever happened. Obviously, no one but the person involved will ever really know the truth, but I did manage to find an obituary for Robert Richardson from Toledo, Ohio, who would have been 31 at the time of the incident. He was described as a smart, independent thinker who always took every detail into account and did not believe anything simply because someone told him to. Could this be the Robert Richardson who had the encounter? Number 2. Peter Rojcewicz. Peter was a professor of folklore at Juilliard University in New York. The story, which he originally wrote about under a pseudonym out of fear of ridicule, is from May of 1982. Peter was sitting in the corner of the library by a window reading a book regarding UFOs on recommendation from a colleague. With no indication of why, he suddenly had the sensation that someone was standing behind him. This is when he noticed a leg and a shoe in the corner of his eye. The man this leg belonged to moved into the chair in front of Peter. He had a dark complexion and was dressed in an all-black suit, which, upon reflection, Peter described as much too big for the man, despite him being about 6 feet tall. He had greased back hair and had an accent that Peter could not identify, though assumed to be European of some sort. The man began to inquire about the book Peter was reading, and tried to start general conversation about UFOs, eventually asking him if he had ever seen one or was interested in the phenomenon. Peter told them that he was not, and was not very into the conversation at all. This apparently angered the stranger, as he said, "Flying saucers are the most important fact of the century, and you're not interested?" Peter became fearful the man would become violent, and tried to calm him. Eventually the man did, and once he was assured Peter would not continue to study UFOs, he stood up as if about to walk away, placed his hand on Peter's shoulder, and said, "Go well in your purpose." He then left the library, and Peter never saw him again. From here, the story goes from creepy to possibly unbelievable. Spooked about the encounter, Peter got up to take a walk around the library. He realized he was the only person in the library that was busy only moments before. No librarians were in sight, no guards, and no colleagues or students filled the tables in the halls. He was completely alone. In a panic, he went back to his seat to gather himself. An hour later, he got up to look around again, and everything had returned to normal. Linking back to the theory of alternate planes of existence, which I mentioned in a previous video, as well as the Herbert Hopkins case, it's possible to assume Peter was perhaps on this alternate plane. Do you think this is what happened? Let me know below. And number 1. Denise Stoner. Denise is a well-known person in the UFO community, as she leads many groups and has even written a book on the topic of alien abduction. Now, Denise's story is quite interesting, as she has not only had experiences with men in black, but also women in black. Her morning started off quite odd, as she and her husband did not wake up as they usually had. Their dog, who also slept in their bed, was strangely immobile and very uncharacteristically slept through the morning. During their deep sleep, the doorbell was ringing on repeat. Again, their dog did not respond to the noise and remained still in their bed. She and her husband, who she says is a Vietnam vet, did not hear or react to the doorbell either. It was not until their daughter yelled for her to come to the door, saying, "There are two ladies with black clothes ringing the doorbell and won't stop." She finally jumped from her bed and heard the ringing, at first assuming there was an emergency with the neighbors. Denise had a camera and a microphone set up in her doorway. Before she even reached the door, her eyes focused on the strange video from the monitor. As she recounts, There stood a woman who, to me, resembled a person of Native American ethnic group, if I were to guess. She had shoulder-length black hair with bangs, slightly tanned yet doughy-looking skin, and dark, large black eyes looking straight into the camera. I could see that she had on a black jumper-style dress with thinner than normal straps running from the shoulders to the bib portion of the dress, almost suspenders minus the clips. She had a long-sleeved underblouse in a dark gray shade. Standing next to her was another woman identical to her in description, only shorter in stature by a head. The height was difficult to judge due to the monitor, but she was not as tall as the lower portion of the camera, so I would say just over 5 feet, and the other was just over 4. Denise then unlocked the door and swung it open, only to find no one was there, nor was anyone in the driveway or near her neighbors' houses. There were no cars she did not recognize, and there was no trace that anyone had been there at all. Is this more evidence of the alternate plane theory? What do you think happened? Thanks for watching this episode of Sci-Fives. If you liked it, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out our last video, 5 government-documented UFO reports.